Let me ask you something. And I want you to actually sit with this question before you answer it. What is the one thing every manifestation teacher, every course, every book, every late rabbit hole you've ever gone down has told you to do? Visualize. Feel it. Believe it. Claim it. Hold on to it. Stay focused on what you want. Don't let go. Keep your eye on the prize. Think about it constantly. Write it down every morning. Say the affirmations. Repeat the intentions. Hold the vision. That is the conventional wisdom. That is the received truth of the manifestation world. And I'm about to tell you that for most people, that advice, followed exactly as given with total sincerity and genuine effort, is the very thing quietly strangling their results, not because it's entirely wrong, but because it's missing the single most important piece, the piece nobody talks about because it sounds on the surface like giving up, like weakness, like settling, like failure dressed up in spiritual language. I'm talking about letting go. And before you close this video thinking you've heard this before, let me be very clear about something. What I mean by letting go is not what you think I mean. It is not detachment in the vague, hand-wavy sense. It is not pretending you don't want what you want. It is not surrendering your goals or lowering your standards or deciding that maybe you shouldn't want the house, the income, the relationship, the freedom after all. That's not letting go. That's just disappointment dressed in a robe and calling itself enlightenment. What I mean is something far more precise, far more mechanical. And when you understand it at the level I'm going to explain it today, it will completely change how you approach manifestation. Not as a philosophical shift, as a practical one. Because once I show you what is actually happening in your mind and in your nervous system when you grip too tightly to a desire, you won't be able to unsee it. I've spent years studying this. And I'll be honest with you. I used to be exactly the wrong kind of manifester. I was obsessive. I was focused. I had vision boards. I had affirmations running in my ear while I slept. I was doing everything right on the surface. And I kept hitting a wall I couldn't explain. The things I wanted felt perpetually, maddeningly one step out of reach. Not because I lacked belief. Not because I wasn't doing the work. But because I was holding on too hard. Squeezing the vision so tightly I was suffocating it. The moment I understood why letting go is not the end of manifestation but the actual beginning of it, things started moving, not slowly, quickly. In ways that still, if I sit and think about them carefully, seem almost unreasonable. So here is what we're going to cover today. And I want you to stay with me through all of it, because the first part is going to feel uncomfortable. It might even feel like I'm dismantling something you've built your entire practice around, but that discomfort is useful, because by the end, you're going to have something much stronger to build on. We're going to look at what actually happens neurologically when you obsess over a desire. And the answer is disturbing. We're going to look at why the human mind, at a biological level, cannot simultaneously be in a state of desperate wanting and a state of receiving. We're going to look at what the research on stress, on attention, on cognitive bandwidth tells us about the focused, anxious, constant visualization approach that most people are taught. And then we're going to build a complete picture of what letting go actually means, what it does, why it works, and how you do it in a way that is specific and repeatable rather than just a feeling you hope to stumble into. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I want to show you the single most important shift I made in my own practice, the one that changed the trajectory of my income, my relationships, my sense of who I am and what I'm capable of. Because what I found is that most people are running a manifestation process that is built entirely backwards, and the proof of that is in the results, or more accurately, in the absence of them. Here is the question that should bother you more than it probably does. If focused visualization, repeated affirmations, and sustained emotional intensity actually work the way they're sold, then why are so many sincere, disciplined, genuinely committed people still sitting in the same circumstances they were in 2 years ago, 3 years ago? With more vision boards, more journals, more courses, and the same reality? That's not a small question. That is the question. And the answer to it starts not with a spiritual concept, but with a very specific, a very measurable thing that happens in the human brain when you want something badly and can't stop thinking about it. That thing has a name. It has a mechanism. And once you see it, the entire conventional approach to manifestation starts to look not just ineffective, but actively counterproductive. So let's start there. Let's start with what wanting actually does to your brain. Because if you think it opens you up to receiving, you're about to find out that in most cases it does exactly the opposite. And the reason is stranger than you'd expect. Let's talk about your brain for a moment, not in a vague motivational way, in a precise mechanical way. Because your brain is not a wish-making machine. It is a threat detection and pattern recognition machine. That is what it was built for over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. And understanding that one fact will explain more about why manifestation fails for most people than anything else you've ever read on the subject. Here is what happens when you want something badly. And I mean really badly. The kind of wanting that has you checking for signs, replaying scenarios, lying awake running calculations about how it could happen and when. When you're in that state, your brain doesn't register the desire as a destination. It registers it as a gap, a discrepancy between where you are and where you want to be. And your nervous system treats that gap the same way it treats any other perceived threat. It activates. There is a part of your brain called the amygdala. You've probably heard of it. It's the structure responsible for emotional processing and threat response. When you perceive danger, real or imagined, the amygdala fires. It sends a signal that cascades through your entire nervous system. Cortisol gets released, adrenaline follows. Your heart rate increases slightly, your attention narrows, your body shifts into a state of high alert. This is the stress response. And here is the critical thing most people don't realize. The amygdala cannot tell the difference between a physical threat and an emotional one. It cannot distinguish between a lion in the grass and the thought, what if this never happens for me? Both register as danger. Both trigger the same cascade. So when you sit down to visualize the life you want with desperate intensity, when you feel the gap between your current reality and your desired one like a physical ache, when you repeat affirmations through gritted teeth hoping this time they'll finally stick, your nervous system is not relaxing into a state of receptivity. It is bracing. It is defending. It is running a quiet, constant background program that sounds like this: something is wrong, something is missing, something is not safe yet. And here is where it gets important. That program, that low-level alarm state, has a very specific effect on your cognition. Researchers call it attentional narrowing. When you're under stress, when the nervous system is activated, your field of attention quite literally contracts. You stop seeing the wide picture. You stop noticing peripheral information, unexpected opportunities, subtle shifts in your environment. Your brain is too busy scanning for the threat to notice the door that just opened 3 feet to your left. Think about what that means for manifestation. If manifestation involves, among other things, noticing and acting on opportunities, recognizing synchronicities, being in the right mental and emotional state to make the decisions that move you toward what you want, then a contracted, stress-activated nervous system is almost perfectly designed to prevent it. Not because the universe is withholding anything, but because you are neurologically incapable of seeing what's already there. There's another piece to this. Psychologists have studied something called the scarcity mindset extensively. When people are in a state of lack, genuinely lacking resources, time, money, options, something measurable happens to their cognitive capacity. Their IQ functionally drops, not permanently. But while they're in that state of perceived scarcity, their ability to think flexibly, to plan, to see options, to make good decisions is measurably impaired. The mind consumed by what it doesn't have has less bandwidth available for everything else. Now apply that to someone who has trained themselves to feel the reality of their desire so intensely that the absence of it is a constant, humming source of low-grade distress. That person is not walking around in a state of open, receptive, expansive possibility. They are walking around with a significant portion of their cognitive and emotional bandwidth occupied. Taken up, unavailable. Running a background process called "I don't have this yet." This is the trap, and it is a trap that the conventional manifestation approach, the relentless focus, the desperate emotional intensity, the never letting go of the vision, actively sets for you, with the best of intentions, leading you directly away from the state that actually produces results. Now here is something even more unsettling. The more you care about something, the more susceptible you are to this trap. The bigger the desire, the relationship, the financial breakthrough, the health transformation, the more emotional charge it carries. And the more emotional charge it carries, the more likely it is to trigger exactly the nervous system response I've just described. Which means the things you want most desperately are the things your current approach is least equipped to help you get. That should bother you. It bothered me enormously when I first understood it clearly. Because it meant that all the intensity I'd been pouring into my practice wasn't neutral. It wasn't just ineffective. It was working against me in a very specific, measurable, neurological way. But here is the other side of this. And this is where it starts to get interesting. If the problem is a nervous system in a state of activation, a mind contracted around lack, a cognitive field narrowed by stress, then the solution is not more effort. It is not stronger belief or louder affirmations or more vivid visualization. The solution is a specific kind of release, a deliberate, practiced, deeply misunderstood state that most people walk past without recognizing it as the most powerful thing they could possibly do. That state has a name, and it's not what you think it is. Let me introduce you to a distinction that changed everything for me. And I want you to hold it carefully because it is subtle. But the difference between these two things is the difference between a manifestation practice that produces results and one that produces frustration dressed up as spiritual discipline. The distinction is this: there is a difference between wanting something and needing it. And that difference is not semantic, it is not philosophical wordplay. It is a completely different neurological state, a completely different electromagnetic signature, a completely different signal you are sending out into the world and into your own subconscious mind every single moment you are in one versus the other. Wanting something from a place of fullness sounds like this. I would love for this to happen. I can clearly see it. I can feel what it would be like. And I am completely fine whether it arrives tomorrow or 6 months from now, because my sense of who I am and whether my life is good does not depend on this outcome. Needing something from a place of lack sounds like this. I have to have this. Something is wrong with my life until this arrives. I cannot fully relax or be happy or feel successful until this is in my physical reality. Every day it isn't here is a day I am behind where I should be. Now be honest with yourself. When you sit down to visualize your desire, when you write in your manifestation journal, when you repeat your affirmations, which of those two voices is actually running underneath the practice? Because most people, if they are truly honest, are operating from the second one while trying to perform the first one. And the subconscious mind, the part of your mind that actually does the heavy lifting in manifestation, is not listening to the performance. It is listening to the signal underneath it. This is why affirmations so often fail. Not because they are a bad tool, but because most people are using them to paint over a wall that is structurally cracked. You can say, I am abundant, 1,000 times with a smile on your face, but if the feeling underneath those words is, I am saying this because I am terrified that I am not, then the affirmation is not reprogramming anything. It is creating noise on top of a very clear signal that says lack, lack, lack. The subconscious doesn't read the words, it reads the energy, it reads the state. And the state of desperate, contracted, I need this to be okay wanting is broadcasting a frequency that is precisely misaligned with the frequency of having. Now here is where most people get confused. Because when I say the solution is detachment, they hear resignation. They think I'm telling them to stop caring, to pretend they don't want what they want, to perform a kind of hollow indifference and hope the universe rewards them for their convincing acting job. That is not what I'm saying. That is not detachment, that is suppression. And suppression doesn't fool anyone, least of all your own nervous system. Real detachment, the kind that actually produces results, is not the absence of desire. It is desire without desperation. It is wanting something clearly, specifically, fully, and completely, while your identity, your sense of safety, your feeling of being whole and worthy and already enough, remains entirely independent of whether or not it arrives. Think about someone who already has what you want, not in the abstract. Think about a specific version of you, 5 years from now, who has the income, the relationship, the freedom, whatever it is you're reaching for. How does that version of you feel about your current desire? They're not desperate for it. They're not white-knuckling a vision board. They already have it. They're relaxed about it. They can think about it with warmth and ease rather than urgency and anxiety. That state, that relaxed, warm, unhurried relationship with your desire, that is the receiving state. That is the frequency of having rather than the frequency of wanting. And the goal of letting go is not to abandon the desire. It is to shift your relationship with it from one of desperate grasping to one of calm, confident, almost casual expectation. There is a way the nervous system behaves when it is in this state that is the direct opposite of everything I described in the last section. When the stress response is not activated, when the amygdala is quiet, when the body is not bracing against a perceived threat, something remarkable happens. The prefrontal cortex comes back online. The part of your brain responsible for creative thinking, pattern recognition, long-term planning, and social intelligence re-engages. Your attentional field expands. You start noticing things you were too contracted to see before. Opportunities that were always there. Connections that were always available. Paths that your stressed, narrowed mind was walking past every single day. This is not magic. This is neuroscience. The brain in a calm, open, resourceful state is a fundamentally different instrument than the brain in an anxious, contracted, desperate state. And the things that become visible to you in that calm state are quite literally invisible to you in the anxious one. Not metaphorically invisible, neurologically invisible. Your brain was filtering them out as irrelevant because it was too busy managing the low-level alarm. I want you to think about a time in your own life when something good came to you unexpectedly, when an opportunity appeared from a direction you weren't looking, when a connection, a conversation, a seemingly random event opened a door you hadn't even known existed. I would be willing to bet that in most of those cases, you were not in a state of desperate, focused wanting at the time. You were probably relaxed. Distracted by something else. Not trying. Just open. That was not coincidence. That was your nervous system in a receiving state. That was what happens when the grip loosens and the field expands. And here is the thing. That state is not something that just happens to you randomly. It is something you can learn to cultivate deliberately, consistently, not as a passive hope but as a practiced skill. That practice is what letting go actually means. And the method of it is more specific than most people realize. So let's get specific. Because everything I've described so far is only useful if it translates into something you can actually do. And this is where most conversations about letting go fall apart. They stay in the philosophical zone. They tell you to trust the universe to release attachment, to surrender. And then they leave you standing there wondering what that means on a Tuesday morning, when the bills are due and nothing has changed and the gap between where you are and where you want to be feels very large and very real. So I want to give you a framework. Not a feeling to chase. A framework. Something with structure and sequence that you can apply deliberately rather than hoping to stumble into it when life happens to be going smoothly. The first thing to understand is that letting go is not a one-time event. It is not a moment of dramatic surrender where you release everything to the universe and then sit back and wait. It is a practice, a daily, sometimes hourly practice of noticing when you have slipped back into the contracted, desperate, needing state and consciously returning to the open, calm, detached, wanting state. Like a musician tuning an instrument. You don't tune it once and assume it stays in tune forever. You check it, you adjust. You return to the correct frequency again and again. The second thing to understand is that letting go has a very specific opposite that you need to be able to recognize. The opposite of letting go is not caring deeply. That is a false dichotomy that trips a lot of people up. You can care deeply about something and still be in a state of letting go. The opposite of letting go is monitoring. It is the constant checking, the scanning for evidence, the daily assessment of whether your manifestation is closer or further away than it was yesterday. That monitoring, that vigilant watching of the gap, is what keeps the nervous system activated. That is what maintains the stress response. That is what holds the door closed. So the first practical instruction is this. Stop measuring the gap. Stop checking the distance between where you are and where you want to be. Not because the gap isn't real. It might be very real. But every time you measure it, you are reinforcing the signal of lack. You are broadcasting "I don't have this yet" with full emotional intensity. And as we've established, that signal is working directly against you. The third thing, and this is the one most people skip because it requires genuine honesty, is to find what psychologists call the secondary gain in your wanting. Here is an uncomfortable question. What does holding on to this desire, in its current state of unfulfilled wanting, give you? Because in most cases it gives you something. Maybe it gives you an identity. You are the person who is on the path to success, who is becoming, who is working towards something. And if the desire were to disappear, either by arriving or by being genuinely released, you would have to figure out who you are without it. Maybe it gives you a reason to stay safe. As long as you haven't achieved the thing yet, you can't fail at having it. The wanting is safer than the risking. Maybe it gives you something to bond over, a shared struggle, a story you tell about yourself. None of this is a character flaw. It is just human psychology. But it is important to look at clearly because that secondary gain is often the hidden hook that keeps people attached to their wanting in a way that prevents them from ever moving into receiving. Now here is where I want to be direct with you about something. Everything I've just described, the framework, the mechanism, the daily practice of returning to the correct state, the work of identifying what's keeping you attached. This is not something most people can figure out entirely on their own. Not because they're not smart enough, but because the beliefs and patterns that create the desperate wanting state are subconscious. By definition, you cannot see them clearly with the same mind that created them. You need a structure, a methodology that works at the level where the real programming lives. I spent years trying to piece this together from fragments. A concept here, a technique there, a breakthrough followed by sliding back into old patterns because I didn't have a complete system that addressed all the layers simultaneously. Eventually, I found a method that did, and I've left it in the description below. If you're serious about changing your reality, start here. I left the manifestation method I personally use in the description. It's not a collection of affirmations or a mood board tutorial. It is a structured, step-by-step guide to reprogramming the subconscious patterns that keep you locked in the wanting state and moving you deliberately into the receiving state. The letting go I've been describing today is built into the methodology at every stage. It's the most complete approach I've come across, and it's what I use consistently. Now, back to the framework, because there's one more piece that most people miss entirely, and it is arguably the most important practical shift you can make. Once you have stopped monitoring the gap, once you have identified and released the secondary gain, the question becomes, what do you fill that space with? Because nature abhors a vacuum. The mind will not simply sit in emptiness. If you remove the obsessive wanting without replacing it with something specific, the mind will drift back to the wanting almost immediately. The gap is magnetic, it pulls attention. The answer to what you fill it with is the piece that transforms letting go from a passive, somewhat hopeful act into an active, generative, Genuinely powerful practice. And it has to do with where you direct your identity rather than your attention. Here is a question that sounds simple but contains almost everything. Who are you when you are not thinking about what you want? Take a moment with that. Because most people, if they are honest, don't have a clean answer. Their identity, their sense of who they are and what their life means, is deeply entangled with their desires, with the gap between where they are and where they want to be. They are the person who is trying to get to the next level, the person who is working toward financial freedom, the person who is manifesting the relationship. Their self-concept is organized around the journey toward the thing rather than around who they already are, independent of the thing. And this is the root of the problem. Not the surface problem of being too focused or too stressed, though those are real, the root problem. Because when your identity is organized around wanting, letting go feels like self-erasure. It feels like if I release this desire, I lose myself. I don't know who I am without this goal. And so the grip tightens, not out of laziness or lack of discipline, out of a very deep, very understandable fear of disappearing. This is why the conventional instruction to just let go is so unhelpful for most people. They hear it and they try it, and it lasts about 40 minutes before the wanting rushes back in, stronger than before, because the instruction asked them to create an identity vacuum without giving them anything to fill it with. The mind cannot sustain emptiness. It will always reach for something to organize itself around. And if that something isn't provided deliberately, the mind will reach for the most familiar thing available. Which is the desire, the gap, the wanting, the not yet. So the question is not how do I stop focusing on what I want? The question is what do I organize my identity around instead? And the answer, the one that actually works at the level where the real change happens, is this. You organize your identity around who you are in the having of it, not in the wanting of it, not in the journey toward it, in the arrived state, in the version of you for whom this thing is already the baseline. Let me be specific about what that means practically, because this is not the same as visualization. Visualization is a technique where you picture a scene, a future moment, a desired outcome. You see the house, the bank account number, the relationship, the body. That is an attentional practice. You are directing your focus toward a desired image, and it has value. But it is not the same as an identity practice. An identity practice asks a different question entirely. It does not ask, what does my desired life look like? It asks, who am I in that life? How do I make decisions from that place? What do I notice? What do I value? How do I carry myself? What feels ordinary and unremarkable to me that currently feels extraordinary and out of reach? What problems am I solving from that version of myself? What am I no longer worried about? When you operate from identity rather than attention, something fundamentally different happens. You stop chasing the thing and start being the person who already has it. And being is a completely different neurological state than chasing. Chasing activates the stress response, narrows attention, broadcasts lack. Being activates the parasympathetic nervous system, expands awareness, broadcasts sufficiency. Being feels like home. And the nervous system, when it feels at home, stops bracing, stops defending, opens. There is research in psychology on something called behavioral confirmation. The finding, replicated across dozens of studies, is that people consistently act in ways that confirm their existing self-concept. Not their desired self-concept, their existing one, the one they actually believe at a felt subconscious level is true about them. This means that until your identity genuinely shifts, your behavior will keep reflecting the old story regardless of how hard you consciously try to act differently. You can force new actions through willpower for a while. But willpower is a finite resource. Identity is not. Identity runs on autopilot. It doesn't require effort because it isn't trying to be anything. It simply is. This is why two people can learn exactly the same manifestation technique and get completely different results. The technique is identical. The identity from which they are running it is not. One person is doing the technique as someone who already is the version they want to become. The other is doing the technique as someone who desperately wants to become that version, but secretly isn't sure they ever will. The subconscious mind reads that difference immediately, and it responds accordingly. So the practical work here is not more visualization, it is identity examination. It is sitting down and asking honestly, when I think about my desire, what story am I telling about myself in relation to it? Am I the person it belongs to? Or am I the person reaching for something that doesn't quite feel like mine yet? And if the honest answer is the second one, the work is to find where that belief lives, what experience created it, what it is protecting, and how to dissolve it at the root rather than paper over it with positive thinking. I want to tell you something from my own experience here. The shift in my financial reality did not happen when I found the right strategy. It happened when I stopped being the person who was trying to get wealthy and became, at an identity level, the person for whom wealth was simply consistent with who I was. That shift preceded the external change. It was not a reward for the external change. It was the cause of it. And that shift did not happen through visualization alone. It happened through a specific, structured process of identifying and dissolving the subconscious beliefs that were quietly insisting that the wealthy version of me was someone else, not me. Someday maybe, but not yet. Not quite. That not yet is the most expensive belief most people are carrying. And dismantling it is the real work of manifestation. Which brings us to the question of what gets in the way of that dismantling. Because it is rarely a lack of desire or a lack of effort. It is almost always one of three specific internal blocks. And each of them has a direct, practical solution. Let me give you the charge sheet. Because if you have been doing everything right on the surface and still not seeing the results you expect, the reason almost always comes down to one of three things. Three specific internal blocks that sit between where you are and the identity shift we discussed in Part 5. Three patterns that operate quietly below the level of conscious awareness, sabotaging the process from the inside while you keep adding more techniques on the outside. I want to go through each one carefully, not just naming them but showing you exactly how they operate, how to recognize them in yourself, and what the actual dissolving process looks like. Because naming a block without dissolving it is just sophisticated self-awareness that changes nothing. And changing nothing is not why you're here. The first block is unworthiness. And before you say I know about this one, let me show you something about it that most people miss. Because unworthiness is rarely experienced as the thought I am not worthy. That would be too obvious. The conscious mind would reject it immediately. Instead, unworthiness operates through a much more subtle set of disguises. It shows up as the thought I just need to work harder first. It shows up as the belief that the good things I want are available to other people, but require exceptional circumstances in my case. It shows up as the pattern of almost. Things getting close and then falling apart, opportunities appearing and then dissolving at the last moment, money coming in and then immediately going out, relationships beginning beautifully and then hitting a ceiling. That pattern of almost is unworthiness in action. The subconscious mind, in its misguided attempt to keep you safe and consistent with your self-concept, will allow you to get close enough to feel like progress is happening, but will engineer a retreat just before the full arrival. Because full arrival would require you to be someone your subconscious doesn't yet recognize as you. The dissolving process for unworthiness is not self-love affirmations. Those are useful but insufficient. The dissolving process is evidence accumulation combined with origin examination. Evidence accumulation means deliberately, systematically building a case for your own worthiness using specific, concrete, undeniable examples from your actual life. Not generic statements about human worth, specific evidence. Times you created value, times you were chosen, times things worked, times you showed up and it mattered. The subconscious responds to evidence in a way it does not respond to declarations. You are not telling it what to believe. You are showing it what is already true. Origin examination means tracing the unworthiness belief back to its source. Not to wallow in the past but to recognize that the belief was formed by a specific experience, usually in childhood, that has been running on autopilot ever since. When you can see the origin clearly, the belief loses its status as truth and becomes what it actually is. A conclusion a younger version of you drew from a limited set of data that is no longer relevant to your current life. That recognition alone begins to loosen its grip. The second block is distrust. And this one is particularly common among people who have been practicing manifestation for a while without seeing consistent results. Because every time you set an intention and it doesn't arrive on your timeline, every time you do the work and nothing visibly changes, you accumulate a quiet body of evidence that says this doesn't work for me, and that evidence hardens into distrust. Not just distrust of the process, distrust of yourself, of your own ability to perceive clearly, to choose correctly, to deserve the outcome, to execute the shift. Distrust keeps you in a very specific behavioral loop. You try a technique, you watch for results, you see nothing definitive, you doubt, you switch techniques, you try again, you watch, you doubt. Each cycle reinforcing the core belief that you are someone this doesn't quite work for. And the watching, the constant monitoring for results, is itself the distrust in action. Trust does not check the tracking number every hour. Trust plants the seed and waters it and goes about its life, knowing the growth is happening even when it isn't visible yet. The dissolving process for distrust is what I call anchored retrospection. You go back through your life and you find every example of something working out that you didn't engineer consciously. Every unexpected turn that led somewhere good. Every moment where you were not in control and things resolved in your favor anyway. Most people have far more of these than they consciously acknowledge because the mind, particularly the stressed, contracted mind, has a well-documented negativity bias. It remembers the failures with high definition and the quiet miracles with soft focus. Anchored retrospection is the deliberate reversal of that bias. It is rebuilding the evidence base for trust using data that was always there but being chronically underweighted. The third block is the need for control. And this one is the most directly related to the letting go conversation because the need for control is precisely what makes letting go feel dangerous. The need for control says I cannot relax my grip because if I do, nothing will happen. If I stop pushing, stop focusing, stop managing this outcome, it will slip away entirely. This block is almost always rooted in a history of things going wrong when you weren't vigilant. Early experiences of chaos, instability, unpredictability, where staying alert and in control felt like the only way to stay safe. And so the nervous system learned, grip equals safety, release equals danger. The dissolving process for the need for control is graduated surrender. Not dramatic all-at-once release, which the nervous system will resist violently, but small incremental experiments in letting go that build a new evidence base. You release control of one small thing and you watch what happens. Usually what happens is nothing catastrophic. Your nervous system notes that you release something slightly larger. Again, nothing catastrophic. Each successful experiment in releasing quietly rewrites the subconscious equation from grip equals safety to release equals safety. Over time, over enough experiments, the nervous system stops treating letting go as a threat and starts treating it as the natural, familiar, comfortable state. That retraining is not fast, but it is consistent, and consistency is what the subconscious responds to above all else. Now here is the important thing about all three of these blocks. They do not operate in isolation. Most people are carrying all three simultaneously in different proportions, and they interact with each other in ways that can make the whole system feel impossibly tangled. Unworthiness feeds distrust. Distrust feeds the need for control. The need for control reinforces unworthiness because constantly needing to manage outcomes is itself a statement that you don't trust the universe or yourself to produce good results without your anxious intervention. The way out of that tangle is not to pull harder at any individual thread. It is to find the organizing belief underneath all three. The one core story that is generating all of them simultaneously. And when you dissolve that, all three begin to loosen at once. Every belief system has a load-bearing wall. In architecture, a load-bearing wall is the one you cannot remove without the entire structure collapsing. It is the wall that everything else depends on. And in the internal architecture of a person who is stuck, who is doing everything right on the surface and still not moving, there is always a load-bearing belief. One core story that is quietly holding up every other limiting pattern in the building. Unworthiness, distrust, the need for control. These are not separate problems with separate solutions. They are symptoms. They are the cracks in the walls and the damp in the ceiling. But underneath them, holding them all in place, is one foundational belief about the nature of reality and your place in it. And until you find that belief and dissolve it at the root, you can work on the symptoms indefinitely without ever resolving the structure. So how do you find it? There is a process I want to walk you through. It is not complicated, but it requires honesty. The kind of honesty that is uncomfortable in the way that pressing on a bruise is uncomfortable. Productive discomfort. The kind that tells you exactly where the work needs to happen. Start with your desire. The specific thing you have been wanting and not yet receiving. Hold it clearly in your mind. Now ask yourself this question and write down the first answer that comes, not the considered answer, not the answer you think you should give, the first raw instinctive answer. Why don't I have this yet? Most people's first answer will be logistical. I don't have the right connections. I don't have enough money to start. I haven't found the right person yet. The timing hasn't been right. These are surface answers. They are real in one sense, but they are not the load-bearing wall. They are the furniture in the room, not the structure of the building. So you go one level deeper. You take that logistical answer and you ask why again. Why don't I have the right connections? Why hasn't the timing been right? And you keep going, layer after layer until you reach an answer that has emotional weight. An answer that lands in your body rather than just your mind. An answer that feels uncomfortably true rather than just analytically reasonable. That answer, the one with the emotional charge, the one that produces a slight constriction in your chest when you say it out loud, that is approaching the load-bearing wall. For most people it sounds something like one of these. People like me don't end up with things like that. Good things happen for others but always seem to fall through for me. Every time I get close to something good, something goes wrong. I fundamentally don't trust that life works in my favor. I have to earn everything through suffering first. I am not the kind of person who gets things easily. Do any of those land for you? Really land. Not intellectually but physically. Because when you find the one that does, when you feel the slight catch in your breathing and the recognition that yes, some part of me actually believes this, you have found the load-bearing wall. And here is what you do with it. You do not attack it. You do not try to replace it immediately with its opposite. That is the affirmation trap again. You cannot bulldoze a load-bearing wall without the whole building coming down, and the subconscious will resist any attempt to do so with everything it has. Instead, you interrogate it. You ask it questions. You treat it like a witness on a stand rather than a truth carved in stone. When did I first decide this was true? What happened that made this belief feel necessary? What was it protecting me from at the time? Is that thing still a threat now? What would actually happen if this belief were wrong? What evidence exists in my life right now that contradicts this belief? Not evidence I am looking for to feel better. Actual contradictory evidence that is already there. That interrogation process done consistently does something very specific. It moves the belief from the category of obvious truth into the category of questionable assumption. And a questionable assumption has no power over you. A questionable assumption is just a thought you haven't examined yet. Once examined, it loses the automatic, unquestioned authority it had been running on for years. Now, the daily practice. Because all of this is only useful if it has an operational form. Something you do every day that keeps the system running in the right direction, rather than sliding back toward the old patterns the moment life gets difficult. The practice has 3 components and it takes less than 15 minutes. The first component is a morning state calibration. Before you check your phone, before you engage with the demands of the day, you spend 5 minutes consciously choosing your state. Not your mood, your state. The distinction matters. Mood is reactive. State is chosen. You ask yourself one question. Who am I being today? And you answer it from the identity of the version of you who already has what you want. You don't visualize what that person has. You feel how that person is. The quality of their attention. The texture of their confidence. The particular flavor of their ease. You inhabit that for 5 minutes. Not performing it. Inhabiting it. The second component is a midday pattern interrupt. At some point in the middle of your day, you pause and you check for monitoring. You ask yourself honestly, have I been measuring the gap today? Have I been scanning for evidence of progress or lack of progress? Have I been in the contracted wanting state without noticing? If the answer is yes, you don't judge it. You simply return. You do a 60-second version of the morning state calibration and you reorient. That's it, no drama, no starting over. Just a quiet return to the correct frequency. The third component is an evening evidence log, not a gratitude journal in the generic sense. A specific log of moments from the day where things worked in your favor without your anxious intervention. Small things count. Large things count. The point is to systematically train your attention toward the evidence of a universe that is cooperative rather than indifferent. Over time, this retrains the negativity bias. It builds the evidence base for trust. It makes the receiving state feel increasingly familiar and the contracted wanting state feel increasingly foreign. That familiarity is everything. Because the subconscious moves toward what is familiar. When the receiving state becomes your default, when openness and trust and detached confident desire become the normal texture of your inner life, you stop having to work at manifestation. You stop having to force and push and grip. The work becomes the daily maintenance of a state that is already producing results, rather than the desperate effort to produce results from a state that is working against you. And there is one final piece, the most counterintuitive one of all. The piece that brings everything full circle and explains why letting go is not just a technique within manifestation, but the very condition that makes manifestation possible in the first place. Here is the most counterintuitive truth in this entire conversation. And I want you to sit with it carefully because it sounds paradoxical on the surface, but underneath it is completely, mechanically logical once you understand everything we have covered today. The act of letting go is not something you do after you have done the manifestation work. It is not the final step in a sequence. It is not the reward you get to experience once you have visualized enough and affirmed enough and believed hard enough. Letting go is the condition under which manifestation becomes possible in the first place. It is not the last thing. It is the first thing. Everything else, the clarity of desire, the visualization, the identity work, the belief reprogramming, all of it only functions properly inside a nervous system that has let go. Outside of that state, the best techniques in the world are running on a corrupted operating system. Inside that state, even imperfect techniques produce results. Think about what we have established. The stressed, contracted, desperate wanting state narrows your attentional field, impairs your cognition, broadcasts a frequency of lack, and keeps your nervous system braced against a threat that exists only as a thought. The open, calm, detached wanting state expands your awareness, restores your full cognitive capacity, broadcasts a frequency of sufficiency, and allows your nervous system to function as the extraordinary pattern, recognition and opportunity detection instrument it actually is. These are not equivalent platforms for manifestation work. They are not two different roads to the same destination. One of them leads somewhere, the other runs in circles. And the reason most people are running in circles is not a lack of desire, not a lack of effort, not a failure of belief. It is simply that they are trying to build on a foundation that was never stable. They are trying to manifest from a state of wanting rather than from a state of being. And the universe, or your subconscious mind, or the complex interplay of your neurological state and your behavior, and the opportunities you notice and the decisions you make. Whatever language you prefer for the mechanism does not respond to what you want. It responds to what you are. This is the entire game. What you want, not what you say, not what you visualize, what you fundamentally at a subconscious cellular, nervous system level are, and what you are is not fixed. That is the most important thing I can tell you. The beliefs that are running your current reality were not installed at birth. They were formed by experiences, conclusions, decisions made by a younger version of you operating with incomplete information in circumstances that no longer exist. They feel like truth because they have been running unexamined for so long that they have the texture of reality. But they are not reality, they are a story, and stories can be rewritten, not by pretending the old story never existed, but by doing the specific, structured, consistent work of examining it, dissolving it, and replacing it with a story that is both more empowering and, crucially, more accurate. Because here is something I genuinely believe after everything I have learned and experienced and tested. The version of you that is what you want is not a fantasy. It is not wishful thinking. It is not a compensation for present lack. It is a real, legitimate, available version of you that exists on the other side of a set of subconscious beliefs that are currently presenting themselves as facts. The only distance between who you are now and who that version of you is the distance between your current story and a truer one. That is not a small distance. I want to be honest about that. For some people it is years of careful, consistent inner work. It was for me. There were no shortcuts that I found that were actually short. There were only approaches that worked and approaches that wasted time. And the approaches that worked were always the ones that went deep enough to address the story at the level where it actually lives, in the body, in the nervous system, in the subconscious patterns that were formed long before you ever heard the word manifestation. But here is what I can tell you about that journey from the other side of it. It is worth it in a way that is almost impossible to communicate to someone who hasn't experienced it yet. Not just because of what arrives in your external reality, though that is real and it is significant, but because of who you become in the process. Because when you do this work properly, when you genuinely dissolve the load-bearing wall and rebuild the internal architecture from the ground up, you do not just change your circumstances. You change your experience of being alive. The constant low-level hum of not enough quiets. The anxious monitoring of the gap stops. The desperate grip loosens. And what you are left with is something that the version of you who was white, knuckling a vision board could barely imagine. A genuine, settled, unshakable sense that life is working in your favor. That you are exactly who you need to be. That what belongs to you is already in motion toward you. And that your only job is to stay open enough to receive it. That state is not the destination. That state is the vehicle. And from inside that vehicle, everything moves differently. Opportunities appear that your contracted mind was filtering out entirely. Conversations go places your anxious self would never have allowed them to go. Decisions get made from clarity rather than fear. Actions get taken from inspiration rather than desperation. And the results, the actual tangible external results, begin to reflect a person who is operating from a completely different internal reality. Because they are. I want to leave you with something that has stayed with me since the moment I first understood it clearly. You have been taught that manifestation is about bringing something from out there into your life, about closing the gap between where you are and where you want to be. But that framing already contains the problem. It already assumes the gap. It already places what you want outside of you, in the future, conditional on circumstances changing. And as long as you are operating from that framing, the gap is self-perpetuating. You are doing the very thing that maintains it while trying to close it. The shift is to recognize that what you are actually doing in manifestation is not reaching for something outside yourself. It is uncovering something inside yourself. The wealthy version of you, the loved version, the free version, the healthy version, that person is not waiting in the future for the right circumstances to arrive. That person is waiting underneath the story you have been telling about yourself, underneath the beliefs that have been quietly insisting that you are not quite that person yet, underneath the grip. Let go of the story. Not all at once, not dramatically. Gradually, systematically, honestly, with the right tools and the right framework and the patience to do the work properly. Let go of the story and you do not lose yourself. You find yourself, the version of yourself that was always there, before the conclusions, before the contractions, before the believing that wanting and having were separated by something more than a thought. That is when manifestation begins. Not when you set the intention, not when you do the visualization, not when you say the affirmation, when you let go. That is the moment. That has always been the moment. And here is my question for you. Think about the desire you have been holding most tightly. The one that has been with you the longest. The one that carries the most emotional charge. What would it feel like to want that thing completely, fully, specifically, and also be entirely at peace whether it arrives tomorrow or never? Not indifference. Peace. What would have to be true about you, about your story, about your sense of who you are, for that peace to be genuine rather than performed? Write that down. Because the answer is the exact location of your work. And your work, done honestly and consistently, is the only thing standing between you and the reality you have been reaching for. Leave your answer in the comments. I read them. And I want to know where you are in this.